welcome to CUHK Law and the latest in our Centre for Legal Innovation and Digital Society talks. FTX, JPex and Bitcoin is crypto fraud, fallacy and or the future. So my name is Stephen Gallagher. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers tonight. Crypto evokes reactions in people in very different ways. Warren Buffett famously described crypto as probably rat poison squared. And of course, we do have a number of people who feel that way, but we also have some people who see crypto as something for the future. It's been a topic that in our seminars to do with technology, I think in a way we've been neglecting in recent times. Everything's been overshadowed by artificial intelligence and the law. So I'm really pleased tonight that we have got three experts in the crypto world, perhaps some on the pro side and some on the against, or at least one perhaps on the against side. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce them. So I'll just briefly introduce you our three speakers tonight and then hand over to them because, of course, we've only got an hour. So first, Mr. Julian So is a qualified lawyer in 3 jurisdictions, Singapore, Hong Kong, and England and Wales. And Julian is part of the Blockchain, Tokenization and Web3 practice group at Housen LLP. He's Group Chief Executive Officer at Coinllectibles, Marvion and XBE, a consultant at ProSynergy, of counsel at Housen LLP as well. And apart from legal private practice, Julian has also got more than 15 years experience in the finance industry in all of the 3 Asian financial centers, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo. We also, of course, have Mr. Joshua Chu with us tonight as well. And Joshua, I think very well known in Hong Kong now to do with everything tokenization. Well, he's a qualified lawyer practicing in Hong Kong and Group Chief Risk Officer at Coinlectibles, Marvion and XBE, and Senior Consultant at ProSynergy, of counsel at Housen LLP, and co-chair of Hong Kong Web3 Association. In addition to his professional roles, Joshua is also the current serving co-chair of the Hong Kong Web3 Association, a non-profit dedicated to promoting education for responsible blockchain and Web3 tech integration in traditional businesses. And Joshua has conducted a number of novel cases, including Hong Kong's first crypto litigation back in 2015, and Hong Kong's first court order for service via data room in 2020. So again, he has experience in litigation and issues to do with crypto as well. Professor Kelvin Low, again, very well known. If you're not following Kelvin on LinkedIn, I suggest you do. His views are always interesting on LinkedIn to do with all issues for crypto. And Kelvin, of course, is a professor at law at the National University of Singapore, and he's known to us, of course, because of his time in Hong Kong as well. Kelvin's research interest spans the field of private law, but with particular interests in property, broadly defined. He's published internationally with leading journals, and he's, of course, co-author of a number of editions of the Law of Personal Property, and, of course, also Principles of Singapore Land Law. His works have been cited by the courts in Australia, Canada, England and Wales, Hong Kong, Malaysia, New Zealand and Singapore, as well as law commissions and law reform bodies in Australia, England and Wales, Ireland, New Zealand, Scotland and Singapore as well. So we're delighted to have our 3 speakers with us tonight. We're going to give them a chance to talk to begin with. I think Joshua's going to start, then Julian, then Kelvin, and then we're going to open up to some discussion. Also, please, I'll encourage you, if you've got any questions for our 3 speakers tonight, please feel free to chat them into me, and we can ask those questions of our speakers. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So now I think first we'll hand over to Joshua to give you a little update on recent issues to do with crypto. Then I think we'll go over to Julian and then over to Kelvin. So Joshua, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, for having made such a wonderful introduction of us. One of the first reasons why we're here today is we all need to first understand why are there so much excitement that have led so many people jumped into crypto. And I think I can make a good connection of this hype more than anyone else, because as a former IT professional turned lawyer, the geek nature of my past had led me to actually have the opportunity to work on the very first crypto litigation ever in Hong Kong. And at that time, when I represented Bitfinex back in 2015, I was actually given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when the owner of Bitfinex, JL, offered to pay my legal fees in Bitcoin. At that time, it was only $35 to one Bitcoin. And of course, I understand what it feels like to have FOMO because I did miss out on that particular opportunity. As the partner that I was working with at that time in this very thick Chinese accent said, Hong Kong dollar only. So as I look at how Bitcoin prices soar after that, I really felt that I have missed out on the opportunity. But again, it's also because of the astronomical rise of Bitcoin prices from $35 all the way to 50,000 USD per Bitcoin today that have led to so many people having the imagination that they can actually get rich overnight. However, with this particular hype also, it also highlights that there are certain dangers of people actually jumping into economy that they don't understand about. So fast forward into 2023, as Hong Kong actually passed legislation with government announcements of saying that we want to be the financial center that will become the next virtual asset hub in Asia. We saw a lot of scandals, such as JPex, Hownex coming out. And one of the things that people have failed to understand is that these scams actually occur. When these scams occur, there were actually little to no crypto connection whatsoever, especially in the latter case, Hownex, where it's actually a traditional wire fraud with a crypto story covering it. And that's about the extent of the exposure to crypto, because at the end of the day, all the transactions were in cash. Now, on the flip side, it really highlights that there is a gap in understanding amongst the public as well as those who have actually jumped in, hoping not to miss the opportunity of delivering them to financial freedom, as so many people falsely believe. But does that mean that all and everything that's crypto related is automatically a scam? I would actually say it's not. Now, I myself am not actually a believer of Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of the cryptocurrencies out there, because one of the things that my learned colleagues will be talking about this evening is one of the reasons why there's so many regulators having such a hard time with passing regulations to address these issues, as well as being so having people like Gary Gensler, who actually teaches course on blockchain technology, being so against things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, is because the very owners of the projects in Bitcoin and Ethereum has failed to actually articulate what those token actually represents. And just because they have failed to do it does not mean that there is no potential to the technology. For example, I've worked on a few, aside from the fact that I'm actually representing victims in the JPex saga with virtual asset recovery. I've also worked with a number of major players within the crypto space where they have suffered, for example, cybersecurity attacks over the past few years. In which case, unlike financial crime with traditional fiat currency, where despite the fact that each $500 bill is actually uniquely identifiable by the serial number, similar to how each individual USDT is identifiable by hash, when you steal cash, it's actually very easy to launder. We used to make a joke saying, all you need to do is take it over the harbor or over to Macau and one round in the casino, and it's no longer traceable. And I have actually dealt with very complex fraud, telecommunication fraud, in which case the cash itself was laundered through these casinos entity, in which it becomes very difficult to assert proprietary claim over such assets. On the other hand, we have virtual assets, either fraud or thefts, which have, unlike fiat currency, we have more matured regulators or law enforcement in the US that are actually able to have near 100% tracing and recovery. And the reason being is they have a very mature system which they can flag wallet address or flag individual tokens as being tainted. And whenever at the end of the day, individuals attempt to liquidate them, we're able to trace and find that individual through a number of civil procedure. But of course, I am a proponent saying that blockchain technology with proper application, can revolutionize a lot of ways how commerce is done and can actually be far more traceable and immutable when it comes to commercial crime disputes. But without wishing to take up too much of the other speakers' time, and before losing attention of everyone here, I'm going to pass it on over to my colleague Julian to basically give his take on things of how he has managed to actually solve a lot of the uncertainties of what tokens represent and why early days blockchain project might actually phase out eventually. And before I pass it over to him, just remember, during the dot-com boom, a lot of websites actually have gone successful and is now gone. For those who are actually older, we will actually remember websites like MySpace, which is touted as one of the next generation social media that was going to dominate the globe. But then again, now I don't think anyone is still on that website. But just because projects do have do flounder over time, it does not mean that the internet or certain technologies will be phased out. Of course, there are always a lot of people that would doubt emerging technology. There's resistance towards adoption, which I think is actually a healthy exercise because that's the process that is needed to weed out what is only hype and versus what are projects that are ultimately becoming the next Amazon, the next eBay, and the next technology company that will come on the scene. So I'll pass it over. I'll stop hijacking Julian's computer and pass it back over to him now.
Okay, thanks, Joshua. Good evening, everyone. Look, when Professor Gallagher or Steve asked me whether I would like to join the seminar as a promoter or a supporter of crypto, I obviously said yes, because we are in the business of tokenization. We have tokenized carbon credits. We have tokenized corporate bonds, listed company bonds. We've also tokenized reward points and loyalty programs, right? So obviously, I'm definitely a supporter of crypto. What I hadn't realized was the topic that Professor Gallagher was going to come up with. And when I saw it, I was obviously dumbfounded. I was wondering, when did I actually offended him? Why would he come up with a topic like that? Because out of all the wonderful things that crypto brought to us, the only three things that he mentioned was FTX, JPex, and Bitcoin. But guess what? I can absolutely, completely understand why he did that. Because having taken a closer look at the topic today, I think it's actually very clever. It's in fact brilliant, right? Because if you put the 6 words here, FTX, JPex, Bitcoin, fraud, fallacy, and future, into a table, 3 columns with 2 rows, what you get is you have the first column, which is FTX being paired with fraud. And obviously, all of us know that the founder of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, SBF, has been charged with, I think, 7 counts of fraud. And that's the reason why that has been paired with fraud. But in reality, I think as my colleague Joshua mentioned earlier, I think a lot of the fraud or the elements of fraud, if you take a careful look at it, would still be there, regardless of whether the asset involved was crypto or not, right? In reality, FTX was a centralized exchange. The only connection it had with crypto was that it was actually a platform for the trading of crypto. They were actually running a lot of trading books in order to provide derivatives on crypto. But in reality, crypto itself had really nothing to do with the fraud. And on the second column, you will have JPex paired with Fallacy. And why is that the case? Why is it not paired with fraud? Well, the reason is because although a lot of arrests or multiple arrests have been made in connection with the suspicion of fraud, no one has been convicted of fraud yet in the JPex case. And that's why it's been paired with Fallacy. So that's why I say it's brilliant. But I wouldn't comment on whether there is actually, in fact, the involvement of any fallacies in terms of the promises that were made by a centralized exchange. But again, I want to emphasize that a lot of the less than desirable behavior, again, really had nothing to do with crypto. It was really just human behavior And crypto was just made the scapegoat because it was the underlying asset that was involved in the entire transaction. And finally, of course, Bitcoin and future. So I think, I hope Professor Gallagher is not trying to make me say that there is a lot of future in Bitcoin, because that's obviously also not my proposition today. I find this the most difficult to talk about, not because I don't have an opinion of my own, but the reason is because I think what I'm about to say may be less than favorable to a lot of people who are Bitcoin supporters. And let me explain to you why. Now, Bitcoin is actually the most widely held cryptocurrency in the world today. Okay, and I hate the word cryptocurrency, right? Because to me, a currency is essentially legal tender by a country where the acceptance of the currency is mandated for any goods and services being offered in the country itself. And I don't think any of the cryptocurrencies has any of that kind of legal mandate, right? And that's why I always felt that the word cryptocurrency is confusing at best and misleading sometimes, I would say, to a lot of people. And I think that's really not the way we want to, start any industry with something that's actually misleading. But I think out of all the crypto or all of tokens in the world today, it is true that Bitcoin is probably the only one that can, in my view, satisfy the legal nature of a commodity. And I think if you look at the US SEC views, they've held from the very beginning that Bitcoin is actually a commodity and it's not a security. And the reason for that is that Bitcoin is the only token out there that does not profess to be able to increase in value because of an increase in utilization, an increase of applications being built on the blockchain or anything like that. It's really just a technology tool, an intangible digital asset that's a pure commodity. And the only reason why it would increase in value is because someone else is willing to pay more money for it. Okay, and for that reason, I don't think it is the future. Well, it cannot be the future because it is based on technology. And what it means is that if in the near future we have a better technology, for example, like quantum computing, and you can actually break the cryptography in Bitcoin, that would, in many ways, going to disrupt the blockchain cryptography, and that's going to destroy its core value, right? I think one of the reasons why Bitcoin is meant to hold its value is because it's supposed to be because of its rarity, right? There's only 21 million tokens, but bear in mind, the 21 million tokens is not a legal obligation of anyone, right? It is just simply written into the codes, and it's just a computer code, which means that if someone can break the code, go in and change the number to 210 million, for example, then immediately you can imagine why Bitcoin will immediately lose its value and immediately lose, the kind of following that it has today. And that's why it's not the future. But I have to come to some kind of conclusion today, right? Because I'm supposed to be a supporter of crypto. So I would say this: crypto is not fraud, is not fallacy. It is definitely the future. But it is important for me to define what crypto is, okay? To me, crypto is really the highest available cryptography you can get at any given time, right? And cryptography is going to keep improving over time with different types of technologies, with the improvement of technologies. And it's important because it is intended to protect data in the future, right? So that's definitely important. However, what is important as well is the fact that cryptography on its own is not as interesting as if you had looked at what I call the 3 pillars of blockchain, right? The reason why blockchain is so interesting today is because of its 3 core properties. Blockchain today brings to us 3 very, very important features. One is the distributed ledger technology. This enables anyone in the world to create a trustworthy, distributed, decentralized ledger that is fully transparent. Okay, something that I think is very, very useful all the way going into the future. Second of all is the token. the token is really nothing more than a documentation tool. It's kind of like an enhanced PDF file, right? What you need to do is to be able to write legally binding documentation into the token. And the token is important and it's a gift from blockchain because it has all these wonderful blockchain properties where it's immutable, it's decentralized, and it's transparent. And the third pillar, right, and the third core property that is actually very important in the entire blockchain technology is the availability of auto execution and auto settlement, right? And that comes in the form of what we call smart contracts. These are not legally binding contracts unless you use the law or unless you use an actual legally binding formal contract to make smart contracts binding. But they are actually, in fact, codes that enable auto execution and auto settlement. And for those reasons, I am actually a supporter and I'm in favor of the proposition that crypto is the future. So I hope this is just a very brief overview of what I think and of my opinion for today. I'm going to leave a lot of the discussions for later after Professor Loh has expressed his views. Thank you, Stephen. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you, Joshua, as well. So now I think Kelvin has been controlling himself long enough. It's time to let Kelvin loose.
Right.
Off you go, Kelvin. I'll go straight over to you. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Steve, for inviting me to this very interesting and exciting format for a conference. A brilliant idea. So both Julian and Joshua have put up a lot of ideas, so I won't be able to respond to all of them. I'll just pick a couple of selections. So Joshua started with why there was all this excitement over crypto. So let's start with the original reasons. I think the original reasons really are that there was a lot of dissatisfaction with centralized authorities in the wake of 2008 and Lehman Brothers and the bailouts, right? There is also actually very little financial literacy amongst most people, most parts of the world. They don't really understand how money works. Therefore, the idea of a finite monetary system is instinctively appealing. So a lot of people who haven't done economics don't understand flexible monetary systems. They don't understand how deflation is much worse than inflation. They don't understand why central banks target 2% inflation, for example. And so there was all this excitement, the ability to do away with big banks and so on and so forth. But if you actually look at how the crypto ecosystem works, you will realize that centralized activity dominates, right? The centralized exchanges account for the vast majority of activity. Now, this tells you something, right? Decentralization has never been about the technology, right? Why do we have intermediaries? It's not because we like giant vampire squids, right? We're not instinctively attracted to giant vampire squids. They provide services that people find appealing. So if you look at shares, for example, the stock market was never meant to be intermediated, right? Share transfers initially were done at the books of the companies, but intermediaries basically introduced conveniences to people because you could settle on the books of the intermediaries. It was faster than delivering a share transfer form and so on and so forth. And of course, they also provide a lot of other services quite apart from fast settlement. And this is why we find intermediation. And you see in various jurisdictions, you are allowed to you can hold shares directly. So in England, for example, Crest allows you to set up an account and you can hold your shares directly if you want. But what is the trend? The trend is for direct shareholding to fall, right? So if you look at the numbers of people who bother setting up their own Crest accounts and holding shares directly, this is falling, not increasing, because the intermediaries are still serving a function. And this is also true in crypto. So why do we have all these centralized intermediaries? Well, firstly, the user interface is horrifyingly bad and difficult for anyone who's not a tech geek, right? Secondly, the idea of having to self-custody scares the shit out of a lot of laypersons, right? It's fine if you're a tech bro, but if you're not, the idea that you could lose your private key and lose access, like that chap in Wales trying to dig up a land waste, or you could get hacked, or more likely phished, So people don't want to self-custody. And we're never going to get to the point where everybody is going to be so comfortable with self-custody, right? The other advantage, of course, is settlement on a centralized exchange's books will cost far less than a on-chain transfer, right? So on-chain transfers were cheap in the early years, but that was because of the mining supply. But as mining supply goes down, blockchain transfers are going to get more expensive, which again makes settlement on an exchange more efficient and cheaper. Now, I want to say something about currency because I think both Joshua and Julian mentioned this. So why is it difficult to trace cash? It is difficult to trace cash because we have something called the currency rule. The currency rule is intended to make currency circulate. The idea is that any bona fide purchaser of cash will take free of any better title. So even if the cash was stolen, a bona fide merchant will be able to feel secure in the receipt of cash. Now, this has nothing to do with legal tender, right? Legal tender is actually a very poorly understood concept. Legal tender almost has no role to play in most modern societies. That's why you can walk into a shop and the shop will say, we only accept electronic payments. They're rejecting cash, right? For a variety of reasons. This is entirely possible in most jurisdictions. And in Scotland, there is no legal tender except for coins, right? So notes are not legal tender in Scotland, and it works fine. So legal tender is not really important. So the fact that cryptocurrencies are not mandated is not what is stopping them from being used. What is stopping them from being used is the hijacking of the appeal of the technology. So the original technology, as I explained, was very appealing because you're trying to get rid of all these supposedly greedy financial intermediaries, except of course that hasn't happened. But after a while, the appeal has become instead FOMO. But FOMO then becomes a problem. If you expect the price to keep appreciating, nobody will use it, right? So how does it work? You either have a utility or you don't. The fact that people believe its only purpose is to appreciate in value, then no one will use it. And which is why we don't actually see any utilization of cryptocurrencies for payments, except for very, very small number of cases. Almost nobody does because everyone buying into this space is hoping for it to go up in value. It's all to the moon. Now, the comparison to the internet is something I've mentioned a lot of time is somewhat fallacious because if you look at how the internet developed, even before most of us actually heard about the internet, because this was done by DARPANET being the precursor to the internet, it was originally intended to basically share scarce computing resources. And it succeeded at that. And then from that original success, you had the first killer app, email. Again, very successful, not intended, but followed immediately. Then when the World Wide Web was set up, then we started to see the internet. But what we have is success after success after success. Now, of course, the internet keeps changing, right? So web browsers are no longer the in thing. We do social media instead. But if you compare crypto or blockchain, whichever way you want to look at it, what we see is failure after failure after failure, right? So Bitcoin was supposed to be a currency, completely failed as that. Then it was supposed to be an inflation hedge, failed at that. If you look at the price today, yes, it's supposedly going up again, but look at some of the things that are happening. Many governments have seized a lot of Bitcoin, and for whatever reason, they haven't gotten around to selling it. The US government alone is sitting on $10 billion worth of Bitcoin. Do you think that the market will absorb that much? That's just the US government. Nobody knows how much the Chinese government is sitting on. The Germans seized a couple of billion last month. The UK has seized at least $1 billion or more. So if you look at all of this, and these seizures will be so, right? Because that's what happens to criminal proceeds, right? They will be auctioned off. What happens to the price then? But I don't really care very much about the price. If the technology works, the technology works. Now, I think Joshua mentioned something about crypto recovery, 100% recovery. I've never heard of 100% recovery. Very rare to see 100% recovery. I was speaking to somebody from the Department of Justice in America 2 years back, just after FTX blew up. And I was in Stanford, and they said, yeah, it's wonderful if you are tracking on-chain transfers, right? The blockchain is fantastic. The problem, of course, is it's not very useful for off-chain transfers, for which there is a lot. And the other part that's not terribly helpful is very often they trace and they trace and they trace, they find out who it is. They're not within the jurisdiction, right? They're in North Korea, they're in Myanmar. What are you going to do? Are you going to invade? If you're not prepared to invade, then it's not terribly helpful. Or you may find somebody within the jurisdiction, but maybe they're innocent, right? They didn't notice that you had flagged the wallet, which brings me to a point about the English Law Commission's digital assets report. They had suggested that the law should introduce a bona fide purchase rule, sort of like currency, sort of like shares, right? Now, what would that do? That would mean people will be discouraged from trying to find out whether this particular wallet has been flagged, because the less you know, the more likely you are not to have notice. And unlike shares and unlike traditional money wire transfers, there is no way to freeze transactions. There's no way to reverse transactions on-chain, right? Which to me means you have the same rule, but a very different result. It becomes almost like a thief's charter, because eventually you're going to find somebody who's willing to get it off you. They just close their eyes, right? Don't do any checks, because why check? You've got this equivalent of a currency rule. The big difference being that the victim of the theft or the victim of the fraud has no opportunity to kind of freeze the transaction or reverse the transaction before it gets to the hand of a bona fide purchaser. So that, I think, is going to be a horrifyingly bad rule to implement. So let me say something about the three pillars of the technology that Julian mentioned. So we've had distributed ledgers since before there was a blockchain. It's just a different form of distributed ledger technology. I'm personally not terribly excited about distributed ledger technology or the blockchain, because when you hear people talking about DLTs and blockchains and they talk about the security in these technologies, what you need to understand is they're talking about a very narrow conception of security. It's security at the ledger. Nobody can toy with the ledger after the fact. Okay, I've been teaching property law for more than 20 years now. I have not come across a single case, right, where the hacker went after the ledger. If you're talking about, some third world country, yes, they've got a very poorly designed centralized ledger. It is a serious problem. But you know what the solution to a poorly designed centralized ledger is? A better designed centralized ledger. And in first world countries, that just doesn't happen. The end users are targeted. Nobody targets the ledger. Bruce Schneier, who is one of the world's leading cybersecurity experts, he has a very famous quote, which is, only amateurs target the machine. Professionals target people. That's why phishing attacks are the most effective, right? And when you look at how we protect end users in traditional finance, all of these means of protection go out the window if you use a blockchain, right? It's freezing transactions until we can figure out whose claim is better. It's reversing transactions before it gets out of your system. You can't do that with a blockchain, right? So to me, it's dystopia, not utopia, right? Tokens, again, not terribly exciting because it's just digitization, but with all the flaws of the blockchain. Smart contracts I'm even less enamored with. I noticed Elisa is online with us. She may have something to say about them. But look, automation, we've had it in centralized systems since the 1960s. There's something called gyro, right? The problem with automation is if you don't keep it simple, If you try to go for very fanciful automation, right? If X then Y, if B then C, and so on and so forth, then you may run into problems if there are bugs in your smart contracts. And we've seen so many cases of buggy smart contracts. It is very, very difficult to write bug-free code, right? And you know what the solution to bug-free code is? It's debugging. You know what's very difficult to do? Debugging on the blockchain, because it's immutable. It's like amber that freezes the bug on the chain. So until the code runs its course, you can't undo it. What you have to do is find out who has received something it's not supposed to receive, try and get him or her to do a full reversal. That's very impractical, right? So auto execution sounds fantastic, but settlement risks are actually fairly minimal in most advanced financial markets because of all the regulatory rules we have implemented. So why are we trying to solve a non-problem and creating all sorts of other problems in response? Because you have smart contracts feeding off one another. Smart contract A makes a mistake, triggers smart contract B when it shouldn't, which then triggers smart contract C, and then you've got to try and identify everyone, right? Assume they're all within jurisdiction, and then try and get them voluntarily to reverse. To me, that sounds worse than what we have, which is why I think, after 15 plus years, we actually haven't seen very much adoption. Yes, you can issue bonds on the blockchain, but it's not going to solve the problems. You are still going to have a problem where unless everyone in the whole world settles on one blockchain, you are still going to require intermediaries if you want to invest in, say, multiple types of bonds, multiple types of securities, all issued on different blockchains. This is why we see intermediation in the securities market, right? Because I want to diversify my holdings, but I don't want to have 10 different accounts. So I find an intermediary, right, who will manage those 10 different accounts for me. How do you solve that problem? I don't see how you can solve that problem. We've got, I don't know how many thousands of blockchains right now. Everyone wants their own proprietary blockchain. How are you going to get them all to agree? I think I'll just stop there and leave it for discussion and questions, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. So, Julian, Joshua, would you like to come back on any of those points that Kelvin raised in there? I don't know if you're...
Yep. Hi, Steve. So very happy to come back on those questions. I think, look, first of all, like I mentioned earlier, when I say I support crypto, I don't really mean cryptocurrencies. I don't even mean blockchain on its own by itself, right? I think as Kelvin has mentioned, I think at the end of the day, number one, what we're supportive of is, like I said, the best cryptography technology that we can have at any given time. I think that's necessary. The three pillars, I think, are very, very exciting. They may not be perfect today, but I think they're very exciting because having a distributed ledger technology, and as Professor Lulu has mentioned or Kelvin has mentioned, is something that already existed a long time ago, right? We're just slowly going through the process of perfecting it to the point where we think that's something that's really, really usable. And I think today with the blockchain, it is starting to be fairly usable. And his points about tokens not being not having the capability of being frozen or not having the capability of being reversed is that's old technology, right? I mean, if you're talking about Bitcoin today, Ethereum today, these were issued more than 10 years ago. That's true, right? But today there are token formats which actually allows you to freeze tokens in the existing wallet so that they cannot be moved until there is a judgment or there is actually a conclusion as to what the law says and what the rules are and as to who actually owns them. And it's actually possible today to reverse those transactions as well, right? And I think that's where it's important, and that's why we actually strongly believe that tokenizing real-world assets is something that's very, very applicable in today's environment. And look, notwithstanding whatever Kelvin thinks about the entire crypto technology, if you look at JP Morgan recently issued deposit tokens, for example, using tokens to represent their deposits. One would think that deposits are already in perfectly working order. Why would anybody want to tokenize them? But guess what? The daily transaction volume of the JP Morgan deposit tokens is $1 billion today. Why are people trading them? Right? There is a demand for the use of blockchain technology. It's starting in a very permissioned manner. It's starting in some cases on a private blockchain, but that's to control the risk, the same kind of risk that Professor Loh has mentioned. But as we get more and more comfortable that the technology is solid, as we get more and more comfortable with the debugging, for example, as he mentioned, of the codes, is going to slowly grow and enable more and more people to actually trade on the blockchain, right? And yes, the centralized systems might be great. We might think that is fantastic, but think about it. We will eventually reach a day where self-custody is going to be more and more mass adopted, right? They may not be, most people may be afraid of self-custody today because they are already so used to having somebody else custodize their things, right? But having seen, for example, in the US last year, having seen so many regional banks go bust, more and more people are starting to think that they need to custodize their own assets, right? Especially when it comes to bonds, for example. Right now, today, if you want to buy a bond, you're buying a bond through a broker who holds it with the financial institutions that then has an account with maybe Euroclear or Clearstream, and Euroclear and Clearstream is the ultimate legal owner of that bond. If you wanted to take any action, right, you would have to make sure that all of these parties are joined in the action before you can actually take a legal action to enforce the terms of the bonds, because you're not the legal owner of the bonds. And I think things like this can be solved by blockchain. And why should we be preventing that from happening just because technology is not perfect? But look, in all of history, we are always happy to live with a little bit of bugs in technology as we grow and as we develop and as we move into adoption of more advanced technology. And I think I'll stop there and see whether perhaps anyone else has got any other questions, or whether Joshua wants to chime in. Thank you.
And picking up from actually what Julian have actually mentioned, I think what Professor Kelvin actually highlighted is actually we often always say within our circle, at least, Bitcoin is one of the worst PR technology, and we have been spotlighting a lot of the issues that are only associated with early stage technologies like Bitcoin and Ethereum, which is actually, as Julian has actually rightly mentioned, old tech. So we're basically looking through a looking glass on Bitcoin, despite all the interest and excitement that is still associated with it. My comparison has always been that Bitcoin is eventually going to be the MySpace of social media. MySpace was at one point of time extremely popular, but over time it faded away. Now, going back to on a more litigious approach, because I'm actually a litigation solicitor on asset recovery cases. Newer cryptographic technology does allow people to actually have a much better chance at asset recovery when it comes to virtual assets. For example, certain stable coins actually have protocols in place that once you have secured certain judgments, of course, that these judgments are still rare and few, but they have existed. I can't go into details of it because there are certain cases that we're working on at this time. But once you have secured essentially a vesting order from the courts, those stable coins, for example, can actually be burnt and liquidated, regardless of who is holding on to it. And the beauty about virtual assets is it is so much easier to assert a proprietary claim over it. And you cannot just simply say that, and if you have worked with OFAC before, you can't simply say that I have not done my due diligence and looked at and did not check whether the cryptocurrency actually came from a tainted source. Because what OFAC have actually been doing is they have actually been sanctioning wallet address. And any people that actually transact with tumblers, for example, they can't simply say that they're a bona fide recipient, especially when the technology itself made it so much easier for you to actually conduct your KYC and AML checks as compared to fiat currency. So insofar as that is concerned, from my personal experience, I don't speak for everyone, of course. I've worked on multi-million-dollar fiat money laundering cases in the past, which had like at least 10 different level of recipients, which is very hard to recover. But I've also worked on similar scale cryptocurrency disputes before, in which case the ability to recover virtual assets or present the tracing exercise is so much more expedient because it's moved onto the blockchain. Now that is only on the part of asset recovery is concerned. We do believe that self-custodizing of assets, like what Julian have mentioned, is going to be eventually an option that a lot of people want to have. We have seen banking crisis again and again. Actually, I was only in High Court in Hong Kong a year back when I saw the Lehman Brothers liquidation case is actually still ongoing, despite the fact that it has been so many, many years. But the fact that they're still listed in the High Court also highlights the part that when a huge, big traditional finance institution like Lehman Brothers goes under, people are left stuck without immediate recourse for many years to come. But if you're able to self-custodize yourself, that's a risk mitigation option that ought to be made available to the public. And as to whether a person decides to adopt this new technology as a risk mitigation approach or not, that is entirely up to that individual, but should have been done with the proper due diligence, research, and consideration, of course. There's no one-size-fits-all technology or situation that applies each and every single time. And I will always emphasize that you have to study what situation you're in before making an informed decision.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I think I need to go back to Kelvin now. Kelvin, can you address all these, the benefits of tokenization and self-securitization and other things? Kelvin.
Well, it's very hard to respond to claims that these things will all happen in the future because I can't predict the future. And what I can say is that this is a very common refrain in the crypto space. We've been hearing this for 15 years, right? Starting with Bitcoin, this is all going to be money in the future. It's going to be an inflation hedge. This is going to be the way everything happens in the future, except the future always remains the future, right? So think about 7 odd years ago, when I was still at Singapore Management University, we had a visitor from New Zealand who was very pro-blockchain. And she told me, in 5 to 10 years' time, everything's going to be on a blockchain. And as a property lawyer who, one of my specialties is land registries. And one of the things I'm very interested in is how you transition from one form of land registry to another, right? So in Singapore, we transition from a deed registration system to a title registration system. And you always have to accommodate for the changeover of the rules. And so I asked her, how is this going to happen? How is the transition going to happen? Because during the transition period, the blockchain cannot be authoritative, right? She said, it doesn't matter. Everything's going to be blockchain 5 to 10 years. Of course, now we are 7 years on. Hardly anything's on the blockchain. Most of the land registries that talk about putting land on the blockchain, they've stopped talking, right? Sweden, UK, nobody's talking about it anymore. Do we need to tokenize real world assets? A lot of it's really on digital ledgers. So let me respond to some of the things that Julian and Joshua mentioned, right? So you can, of course, set up a blockchain or a permissioned private blockchain where you can freeze transfers, you can reverse transfers, but you have to give someone the power to freeze and reverse transfers. And if you trust this person, why isn't this person just a centralized registrar? Right? Then just run it on a centralized registry. It's going to be a hell of a lot cheaper. The dangers of the registry getting hacked can always be more cheaply solved by having offline backups, regular offline backups. That's how the real world works, right? Or you can have maybe 3 copies active. It doesn't really matter. I just don't see a need for DLTs with 1,000 different copies where you have syncing problems. So the main selling point to a lot of the cyber libertarians of the blockchain has always been it is immutable. No one is in control other than yourself. But the moment you say someone is in control, then I just don't see the point. You can do all this already. So we don't need a blockchain to, sell small fractions of real estate. We have REITs. Been here since the 1960s. Breaking things up has never been difficult. It's always only been difficult to put them together again, right? That's why all these, 80% supermajority acquisitions of land, 90% supermajority acquisitions of land are so contentious. It's not the breaking up that's the difficult part. It's the putting together that is the difficult part. So I still see no real point. You are introducing all the characteristics of a centralized ledger system, but putting it on the blockchain. Why?
Well, just to go on the point about breaking up being easy, we have just passed Valentine's Day, and I can tell that the bloke at Mongkok that recently gave away 99 roses is very difficult in breaking up. But going back to, that's a joke actually, but going back to one of the things, one of the reasons why we are so, we wouldn't say bullish, but excited about the technology is always on the application. And I do agree with you. A lot of people are focused on saying things like immutability and decentralization, but that is not the extent of the application of DLT at the end of the day. At the end of the day, if you look at the policy papers of the PRC as well as Hong Kong, one of the things that we're actually really aiming at is actually enabling smart city concept as well as Web3 economics. And blockchain technology has been identified as a potential key to that puzzle, because with that particular technology, it actually enables a lot more expeditious operations in the smart city. So that is, of course, we do not know when it will eventually be adopted, but we can always know that the pathway of adopting technology to improve lives is something that we can all strive for. And yes, there are a lot of detractors, and yes, there are lots of doubts, but it does not mean that we should refrain ourselves from adopting technology. Keeping in mind, it's only 14 years ago that we still have articles on the front page of newspaper that said internet is a fad. And I can understand why, because I still remember it back in 2010, if you're in the United States and you're stuck on AT&T, the connection is just terrible to the extent that you really want to quit the internet at that point. But just a few years later, technology does overcome certain precipices that allows for mass adoption. Now, as to whether the mass adoption will be DLT or a myriad of other related technologies, we do not know. We can't peep into the future, but we can always say that society is in general moving towards that direction, of course. I'll pass it back to Julian for anything to supplement, of course.
Oh, no. The only point I wanted to make was that I wasn't really just talking about the future. I think, like I mentioned earlier, JP Morgan has tokenized their deposits. They've already done it late last year. And the trading volume of those deposits today is $1 billion per day. There is a reason why blockchain is being adopted. There is real good reasons for it. It may sound like we're trying to bring more problems to something that's already working, but that has always been the problem with technology, right? We always think that we're bringing more problems than what is already working. But in reality, the moment it matures, the moment it becomes mainstream, it will just automatically be adopted, and the people who are not following will just be left behind. I think that's the danger. Thank you.
Well, not necessarily true, because I still know this barrister at DVCs that still refuse to use a computer, and he does handwrite most of his legal drafting, but I'm not sure how he's doing these days.
Thank you, Joshua. Kelvin, did you want to come back on those points just quickly? Because I think I've got to let you come in.
Well, I'll just say that, so far as tokenized deposits are concerned, you won't be left behind, right? When the technology matures, then you change your deposit to a tokenized deposit. There's no reason to get excited right now. And $1 billion is not really very much, considering how TradFi volumes are like. That's really a drop in the ocean. So when we're talking, I don't know, 100 billion per day, maybe then it's something to get excited about. But again, but back to the JP Morgan thing, I just don't understand why it couldn't be done with the JP Morgan centralized ledger. Everything that the JP Morgan coin does can be done on a centralized ledger. So the only thing they're adding, and this kind of goes all the way back to something Joshua said, all they're adding really is the dash of FOMO, right? Say blockchain, magic happens. And this is why there are a lot of frauds that have no underlying crypto technology, but they simply use crypto as a selling point, right? Crypto is just a hook. These people have no blockchains, right? But if people believe that getting in early is a way to get rich quickly, right? But tokenizing your deposit is not going to make you rich, right? $100 million on a centralized ledger is also going to be $100 million on a blockchain. There's no reason to do it now.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. Joshua, did you want to come back on it? We've only got a few minutes left.
Absolutely. Well, I'd just like to end by saying that around a century ago, a British lord famously said, "Why adopt the telephone? Because we have so many messenger boys." Just because you can do it in the good old ways doesn't mean that it's the right way at the end of the day. We simply don't know. And it's easy for us to make those statements on hindsight. Of course, we should leave some time for Q&A.
Julian, did you want? I think we're actually out of time really for Q&A. We have had. I mean, I think that's the nature of the discussion. I was hoping that that you would sort of drive forward with the discussion. I feel sorry for a number of reasons. First of all, I should apologise to Julian and Joshua because I put you forward as the proponents of crypto, and you both made it very clear that you're not great fans of cryptocurrencies anyway. So I'm glad you did put that point. And
the technology, yes, not the currency.
Okay, that sort of thing. And also apologies to those of you who have sent in your questions to me. We've had a number of questions coming in, various things to do with regulation and who should regulate and all these different things, which I think are all interesting questions and would be interesting to hear our three speakers tonight give their views on these things. There's a number of questions that have come in on that. I need to apologize in particular to my colleague, Professor Elisa Mick, who of course is bursting to join in the conversation as well. I should have joined Elisa into this particular panel. Maybe that's something for the future. Maybe we should have given more time to this, and we should have brought some more speakers in to sort of share in this discussion. But I need to thank everyone who's joined in tonight. We had about 600 plus who'd signed up, and I think we had nearly 400 people who joined in today with us in listening in to our three speakers. I need to thank particularly, of course, our three speakers, Professor Kelvin Low, Julian So, and Joshua Chu, for sharing with us their views on various aspects of crypto and tokenization, and perhaps the benefits and perhaps the fact that there may not be certain benefits to do with this.